Part 1. A Day Like Any Other. It was an unseasonably warm afternoon in Charleston, and for Isaiah Johnson, it was a day like any other. The 70-year-old man, tall and broad-shouldered, but slightly stooped with age, had lived in this city for decades. He had seen the world change, progress and regress in waves, especially when it came to race relations. Yet Charleston was his home, a place he had dedicated much of his life to serving. Isaiah was a man of quiet dignity. A well-known figure in the local community, he had spent the last decade serving as the governor of South Carolina. He kept a low profile, preferring to connect with the people on a personal level, often visiting neighborhoods and talking to citizens directly. Isaiah believed that true leadership came from understanding the people you served, not ruling over them from a distant office. And so, without the fanfare that often accompanied his status, he was out for his usual walk that afternoon. Isaiah's attire was simple, an old pair of slacks and a worn plaid shirt. His gray hair was neatly combed, and his face was etched with the wisdom of many years. He was on his way to a local park, a quiet spot he often visited to think, pray, and reflect on his day. The hum of the city surrounded him, but his mind was far from the noise. As Isaiah crossed the street toward the park, a police cruiser pulled up beside him. The screech of tires on the asphalt interrupted his thoughts, and he turned just in time to see two officers exit the vehicle. One of them, a young white officer with a stern expression, walked toward him with an air of authority that Isaiah knew all too well. "Hey, you there!" the officer called out, his voice carrying a sharp edge. "Stop where you are." Isaiah, slightly taken aback, slowed his pace but didn't stop entirely. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked calmly, his voice steady but wary. "Where are you headed?" the officer asked, now standing just a few feet away. His name badge read, Officer Jacobs. "I'm just going to the park," Isaiah replied, nodding toward the open space across the street. "I walk here almost every day." Officer Jacobs eyed him suspiciously. "You got ID on you?" Isaiah furrowed his brow. "What for?" he asked, trying to keep his tone respectful, but failing to hide the confusion. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for," the officer said coldly. An older black man, seen wandering around suspiciously. Isaiah's heart sank. He'd heard those words too many times in his life. Suspicious. He wasn't doing anything wrong, just walking like any other citizen. But the years of discrimination and prejudice had conditioned him to expect this kind of treatment. "I'm just out for a walk, officer," Isaiah said, carefully pulling out his wallet. "Here's my ID." Without even glancing at the ID, Officer Jacobs snatched it from his hand and examined it briefly. "Isaiah Johnson," he muttered under his breath. "Well, we'll just have to check you out at the station." "What for?" Isaiah asked, his voice rising slightly in disbelief. "I haven't done anything wrong." The officer's gaze hardened. "We'll determine that." Without another word, Officer Jacobs roughly grabbed Isaiah by the arm, pulling him toward the cruiser. Isaiah winced as the officer's grip tightened. The old man's mind raced. He hadn't been in this kind of situation for many years, not since before he was elected to office. But here he was, treated like a criminal, just because of his skin color. Isaiah tried to explain, tried to reason, but his words fell on deaf ears. He was shoved into the back of the police car, the door slamming shut behind him. As the cruiser sped away, the park, in Isaiah's peaceful afternoon, faded into the distance. Part 2. The Unraveling. The ride to the station was tense, the weight of injustice hanging heavily in the air. Officer Jacobs and his partner, a more silent and seemingly uncomfortable officer, didn't speak much. Isaiah sat in the back, his mind reeling with disbelief. How could this still be happening? After everything he had fought for in his lifetime, here he was, a sitting governor, being treated like a suspect because of the color of his skin. At the station, the situation didn't improve. Officer Jacobs led Isaiah inside, still gripping his arm tightly. The bustling police station was filled with noise, phones ringing, officers moving back and forth. But Isaiah felt utterly isolated. His identity as governor, his years of service, none of it seemed to matter here. They processed him as they would any other suspect. Fingerprints, mugshots, the whole humiliating ordeal. Isaiah wanted to protest, to demand they call someone who could verify his identity, but the reality of the situation held him back. He knew this wasn't about whether they knew who he was. It was about power and control. After what felt like hours, Isaiah was led to a small, dimly lit interrogation room. Officer Jacob sat across from him, his face still hard and impassive. "You've got quite the record, don't you, old man?" Jacob sneered, pulling out a file. Isaiah frowned. "I have no criminal record," he said quietly. Jacobs ignored him, flipping through the papers. Suspicious behavior, resisting orders, no permanent residence listed. He trailed off, looking up at Isaiah with a smirk. Isaiah's stomach churned with anger. "That's not true. I'm the governor of this state. You can't just—" Jacobs chuckled, shaking his head. "Governor, huh? That's rich. Do you think I'm an idiot?" Isaiah stared at him, his heart pounding. "Call the governor's office," he said firmly. "You'll see who I am." Jacobs leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Oh, I will. But in the meantime, you're staying right here." The minutes ticked by in agonizing silence. Isaiah could feel the injustice burning inside him, the old familiar feeling of being powerless in the face of prejudice. He had worked his entire life to fight this very system, and now he was a victim of it once again. But as time passed, something shifted. A knock at the door interrupted the tense silence, and Jacob stepped out, leaving Isaiah alone. A few moments later, Jacobs returned, his expression no longer smug but uncertain. Behind him stood another officer, a higher-ranking lieutenant, his face pale with realization. "Mr. Johnson," the lieutenant began, his voice trembling, "I'm so sorry for the misunderstanding." Isaiah didn't speak, letting the words hang in the air. You really are the governor," Jacob stammered, disbelief in his eyes. His arrogance had drained away, replaced by a growing sense of dread. "I told you that hours ago," Isaiah said quietly, the exhaustion in his voice palpable. Jacobs looked utterly panicked. He knew the gravity of what he had done. Arresting and humiliating the state governor, an innocent old black man, based on nothing more than racial profiling, was a career-ending, perhaps life-altering mistake. Part 3, the fallout. The apology came quickly, but it was hollow. Isaiah knew it wasn't out of genuine remorse, but out of fear. Officer Jacobs' career was on the line, and he knew it. "I never should have," Jacobs began, but the words caught in his throat. He was shaking now, the reality of his actions sinking in. I didn't know." "That's the problem," Isaiah said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet fury. "You didn't care to know." The lieutenant quickly intervened, offering a string of apologies on behalf of the department. They spoke of misunderstandings and policy changes, trying to mitigate the damage. But Isaiah knew better. He knew that no policy could fix the deep-seated racism that had led to this moment. He stood up, weary but resolute. "You'll be hearing from my office," Isaiah said, "and you can expect changes, real changes." As Isaiah walked out of the station, the weight of the ordeal settled on him. He had spent his entire life fighting for equality, for justice, and here he was, in the twilight of his life, still battling the same demons. But as he stepped into the sunlight, he knew one thing for sure. He wouldn't stop fighting. Not now, not ever. The news of Isaiah's wrongful arrest spread quickly. It became a national story, a painful reminder of the systemic racism that still plagued the country. But it also sparked a movement, a push for accountability and reform in the Charleston Police Department and beyond. Officer Jacobs was suspended and eventually removed from his position, but the consequences of that day reached far beyond him. It forced a reckoning within the community, a call to action that resonated with people far and wide. As for Isaiah, he continued his work as governor, but the incident left a lasting mark on him. It served as a painful reminder of the long road still ahead in the fight for justice and equality. Yet despite the hardships, Isaiah remained steadfast in his belief that change was possible, and he would do everything in his power to make it happen. Because if there was one thing Isaiah had learned in his 70 years of life, it was this: true change comes not from fear or anger, but from the courage to stand up, even when the odds are stacked against you. And as long as there were people like him willing to fight, there was always hope for a better tomorrow.